In the 1960s, the FBI opened a file on Frank Sinatra that eventually grew to more than 2,000 pages. Not because of his music, not because he sold over 150 million records, but because of the men he was seen with. Sinatra, the most famous voice in America, was photographed and reported meeting figures connected to organized crime, names like Lucky Luciano and Sam Giancana. At the same time, he was performing in Las Vegas casinos, moving among politicians, movie stars, and powerful businessmen. So the question that followed him for decades was simple. Was Frank Sinatra just a legendary singer with dangerous friends? Or did the most famous voice in America know far more about that world than anyone realized? By the early 1960s, Frank Sinatra was no longer just a singer. He had become one of the most powerful figures in American entertainment. At the Sand Hotel in Las Vegas, Sinatra walked on stage as the unofficial leader of a group the world soon called the Rat Pack. Alongside Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, he dominated the city's nightlife. Their shows were chaotic, improvised, and electric. Hollywood stars filled the front tables. Politicians appeared backstage. The casino floors below ran all night. But Las Vegas at that time was not just a playground for celebrities. Many of its most successful casinos were widely believed to be controlled or influenced by organized crime families. And Sinatra seemed to move through that world with unusual ease. He attended private parties where powerful men gathered. He was photographed with figures the FBI had already been watching for years. Reports described meetings, flights, and late-night conversations that placed Sinatra close to some of the most controversial names in the American underworld. None of this ever led to criminal charges, but it was enough to attract serious attention. Because when the most famous voice in America kept appearing in rooms full of powerful and dangerous people, investigators began asking a question that would follow Sinatra for the rest of his life. How exactly did a singer become so deeply connected to a world built on power, secrecy, and influence? Frank Sinatra was born on December 12, 1915, in Hoboken, New Jersey, a working-class town sitting just across the Hudson River from Manhattan. At the time, Hoboken was crowded with immigrant families, especially Italians who had arrived in America looking for opportunity. Life there was not glamorous. The streets were loud, competitive, and often controlled by tight community networks where reputation and loyalty mattered almost as much as money. Sinatra grew up in the middle of that world. His father, Anthony Marty Sinatra, had once been a bantamweight boxer before eventually becoming a firefighter in the Hoboken Fire Department. He was quiet, disciplined, and respected locally. Sinatra's mother, however, was the true force in the household. Natalie Dolly, Sinatra was known throughout the neighborhood as a powerful and intimidating personality. She worked as a midwife helping deliver babies in the community, but she was also deeply involved in local politics. Dolly had connections. In neighborhoods like Hoboken during the 1920s and 1930s, politics, business, and informal power networks were often closely linked. Community leaders, political organizers, union figures, and local businessmen frequently relied on relationships built through loyalty and influence. Dolly Sinatra understood that system well. Many people in Hoboken knew that if you needed something arranged or resolved, Dolly Sinatra was someone who could make calls. Frank was her only child. His birth itself was difficult. Doctors used metal forceps to pull the baby from the womb, leaving deep scars on his neck and damaging part of his left ear. The injury followed him for the rest of his life. As a boy, he was often self-conscious about his appearance. Yet despite those insecurities, Sinatra grew up surrounded by a strong sense of identity. In the tight Italian community of Hoboken, family loyalty and neighborhood reputation were everything. But Frank Sinatra was not an academic success. He attended A.J. Demarest High School, but was expelled after only a few weeks. Teachers described him as restless and uninterested in schoolwork. Formal education simply did not hold his attention. Instead, Sinatra spent most of his time wandering the streets, listening to music, and dreaming about a life far beyond Hoboken's narrow blocks. The radio became his greatest influence. During the early 1930s, American households were increasingly filled with the sound of national radio broadcasts. Through that radio, Sinatra discovered singers who seemed to exist in an entirely different world. The voice that affected him the most was Bing Crosby. Crosby's singing style was revolutionary at the time. Instead of projecting loudly like traditional stage singers, he used a microphone to create a softer, more intimate sound. Sinatra studied that technique obsessively. He listened to Crosby's records repeatedly, paying attention not only to notes but to the phrasing, how a line of lyrics could stretch across a melody like a conversation rather than a performance. Sinatra later said he spent hours standing in front of a mirror, pretending he was already on stage, practicing how to control his breathing and how to shape a phrase so that every word carried emotion. Still, dreaming about a career in music was very different from building one. Hoboken did not offer many opportunities for a young man without education or industry connections. Sinatra drifted through small jobs during his late teenage years. At times, he worked as a delivery boy. At other moments, he helped in local bars and clubs. Yet, whenever a chance appeared to sing, even casually, he took it. Slowly, he began entering amateur talent competitions around New Jersey. These events were modest. Some took place in theaters, others in dance halls or community gatherings where the prize might only be a small amount of money or a short local performance contract. But they gave Sinatra something far more important: experience standing in front of an audience. He began noticing something interesting. When he sang quietly instead of loudly, the audience leaned forward. Instead of overpowering the room, his softer delivery made listeners pay closer attention. That instinct, the ability to pull people toward the voice rather than push the voice toward them, would later become one of Sinatra's greatest strengths. By the mid-1930s, Sinatra joined a small singing group called the Hoboken Four. The group eventually appeared on a popular national radio program called Major Beau's Amateur Hour in 1935. Against expectations, they won the contest. For the first time, Frank Sinatra heard the sound of applause from a national audience. It was only a brief moment of success. The Hoboken Four would soon break apart, but the experience planted a powerful idea in Sinatra's mind. The boy who had grown up in the crowded streets of Hoboken might actually have a way out. What he did not realize yet was that entering the music business would expose him to an entirely new world of power, influence, and relationships, a world where talent alone was rarely enough to survive. After the brief success of the Hoboken Four on Major Beau's Amateur Hour in 1935, Frank Sinatra returned home to New Jersey with a difficult realization. Winning a radio contest did not automatically create a career. The group soon disbanded, and Sinatra once again found himself looking for small opportunities just to keep singing. For several years, he performed wherever someone was willing to give him a microphone: dance halls, roadside clubs, and small venues that rarely appeared on entertainment maps. One of those places would quietly change his future. In the late 1930s, Sinatra began singing regularly at a nightclub called a Rustic Cabin, located along a busy highway in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. The club itself was not particularly elegant. It attracted travelers passing through the area rather than dedicated music fans. Yet the Rustic Cabin had one powerful advantage. It broadcasted performances over a local radio station. Night after night, Sinatra stood in front of the microphone performing to a small crowd inside the room while his voice traveled across the region through radio waves. Most evenings, the audience barely noticed him, but Sinatra treated every performance seriously. He practiced a vocal style he had learned from listening to Bing Crosby, keeping his voice relaxed and close to the microphone. Instead of projecting loudly like many singers of the time, he leaned into the microphone and delivered songs with a calm, conversational tone. That style made his voice stand out immediately when heard through radio speakers. In 1939, that difference caught the attention of someone important. Trumpeter and bandleader Harry James happened to hear Sinatra's broadcast from the Rustic Cabin. James had recently left the famous Benny Goodman Orchestra and was forming his own band. Like many bandleaders of the era, he was searching for a vocalist who could help define the sound of his new orchestra. Sinatra's voice sounded fresh compared to the powerful theatrical singers dominating big band music. Harry James offered Sinatra a position as the band's vocalist. For the young singer from Hoboken, it was a life-changing opportunity. Touring with a major orchestra meant traveling across the country, performing in large dance halls, and recording songs that could reach national audiences. In July 1939, Sinatra entered a recording studio for the first time with the Harry James Orchestra and recorded several songs, including All or Nothing at All. The record did not become a major hit immediately, but the experience placed Sinatra inside the professional music industry for the first time. Yet the real transformation came the following year. In 1940, Sinatra received an offer from one of the most powerful band leaders in America, Tommy Dorsey. The Tommy Dorsey Orchestra was already famous nationwide. Its radio broadcasts reached millions of listeners every week. Joining the band meant that Sinatra would suddenly be heard across the entire country. Sinatra accepted without hesitation. The years he spent with Tommy Dorsey became a critical training ground. Dorsey was known not only as a successful bandleader, but also as one of the greatest trombone players in jazz. His playing was famous for its long, smooth musical phrases that seemed to stretch endlessly without obvious breathing breaks. Sinatra became fascinated by that technique. He began studying Dorsey closely during rehearsals. Instead of focusing only on melody, Sinatra paid attention to breathing control. He practiced inhaling deeply and releasing air slowly, so he could sustain longer lines without interruption. This technique transformed the way he sang. Rather than delivering short phrases, Sinatra began shaping entire sentences of lyrics into smooth musical arcs. Listeners noticed the difference. His voice felt personal and intimate, almost like someone speaking directly into the listener's ear. At a time when most singers tried to fill large rooms with powerful projection, Sinatra used a microphone to create a softer connection with the audience. As the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra toured the country, Sinatra's popularity quietly began growing. Letters from fans started arriving at the band's offices asking about the young singer with the dark hair and gentle voice. Radio listeners began requesting songs specifically because Sinatra was singing them. Yet success inside the orchestra created a new ambition. Sinatra no longer wanted to remain simply the vocalist standing beside a bandleader. He wanted something larger, a career built around his own name. Leaving Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, however, was extremely risky. Big band leaders controlled much of the music business during that era. Walking away from one of the most powerful orchestras in the country could easily end a young singer's career. But Sinatra believed the moment had arrived. In 1942, he made the decision to leave the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra and begin performing as a solo artist. Many people inside the music industry considered the move reckless. Without the support of a famous band behind him, Sinatra would have to prove that audiences cared about him alone. Within 2 years, that risk would transform Frank Sinatra from a band vocalist into something the music industry had never seen before, the first modern pop idol. By the time Frank Sinatra left Tommy Dorsey's orchestra in 1942, many people in the music industry believed he had made a dangerous mistake. Big band leaders controlled radio exposure, touring circuits, and recording opportunities. Walking away from that system meant losing the protective structure that had built his early reputation. But Sinatra had something the industry had not fully understood yet. He had an audience that cared about him personally. Once he began performing under his own name, the reaction from fans grew almost immediately. His voice, which sounded intimate and conversational on the radio, translated perfectly to the emerging culture of mass media. During World War II, millions of Americans were listening to music through radio broadcasts at home. Sinatra's style created the feeling that he was singing directly to each individual listener. For many young fans, especially teenage girls, that connection felt intensely personal. The moment that proved Sinatra's power arrived in October 1944 at the Paramount Theater in New York City. Sinatra was scheduled for a series of performances that were expected to draw strong crowds. Instead, what happened shocked even experienced reporters. Thousands of teenage girls flooded the streets around Times Square. Some had arrived hours before the doors opened. Others screamed and cried the moment Sinatra stepped onto stage. Several fans fainted during the performance. Police officers had to control the crowds outside the theater as traffic slowed and the sidewalks filled with young admirers hoping to catch a glimpse of the singer. Newspapers struggled to describe the scene. Eventually, reporters began calling the fans Bobby Soxers, referring to the style of short socks many teenage girls wore at the time. The term quickly became associated with a completely new cultural phenomenon, the idea of teenage music fandom. Long before Elvis Presley or the Beatles would inspire similar reactions, Frank Sinatra had already created the first wave of pop idol hysteria. His success extended far beyond live performances. Sinatra's recordings were selling in enormous numbers. Radio stations played his songs constantly. Titles like I'll Never Smile Again, Nancy with a Laughing Face, and Night and Day became staples of American popular music. His voice carried a sense of emotional sincerity that listeners trusted. Hollywood soon recognized the opportunity. Film studios began offering Sinatra roles in musical and romantic films, believing his popularity would attract movie audiences as easily as concert crowds. By the mid-1940s, he was appearing regularly on screen, further expanding his fame. Magazine covers featured his photograph. Fan mail arrived in overwhelming quantities. Sinatra had become more than a singer. He was a national celebrity. Yet the intensity of that spotlight created its own problems. The same press that celebrated his success also began examining his personal life with increasing curiosity. Reporters followed his relationships, his friendships, and his movements outside the studio. Every public appearance became a potential headline. At the same time, the music industry itself was beginning to evolve. The big band era that had dominated the 1930s and early 1940s was slowly fading. New musical styles were emerging, and younger singers were entering the spotlight. Audiences were beginning to look for different sounds, and record companies were paying attention to those shifts. Sinatra's schedule also pushed his voice to its limits. Touring, recording sessions, radio appearances, and film productions created a workload that would have exhausted almost any performer. Even someone with Sinatra's vocal control could not escape the strain entirely. Subtle changes began appearing in his recordings, small signs that the voice that had carried him to fame might not remain invincible forever. But from the outside, the empire still looked unbreakable. By the late 1940s, Frank Sinatra was the most recognizable singer in America. He had millions of fans, a powerful presence in Hollywood, and influence across radio and popular culture. The hysteria surrounding his concerts had become legendary. Yet behind the applause, the foundations of that success were beginning to weaken. His personal life was becoming more complicated. The industry that had elevated him was changing rapidly, and the emotional pressures of fame were starting to collide with relationships that would soon bring turmoil into his private world. Because in the years ahead, Frank Sinatra would become involved in a relationship so intense that it would shake both his personal life and his career. And the woman at the center of that storm was Ava Gardner. The relationship between Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner did not begin quietly. From the moment they appeared together in public, Hollywood sensed that something volatile was unfolding. Ava Gardner was not just another actress in the studio system. She was widely considered one of the most striking women in Hollywood, but more importantly, she had a reputation for being fiercely independent. Gardner did not behave like the carefully managed stars that studios often tried to control. She spoke openly, lived boldly, and refused to hide her emotions. For Sinatra, that energy was irresistible. At the time he first became involved with Gardner, Sinatra was still married to his first wife, Nancy Barbato. Their marriage had begun long before fame, when Sinatra was still struggling to build a career. Together, they had 3 children and a life that appeared stable from the outside. But Sinatra's rise to fame had already begun changing the dynamics of that relationship. Touring schedules kept him away from home for long periods, and the intense attention from fans and the press created constant pressure. When Gardner entered the picture, the situation exploded into public scandal. Hollywood gossip columnists quickly discovered the affair. In the late 1940s, gossip columns were among the most powerful forces in entertainment journalism. Writers like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons had the ability to shape public perception almost overnight. Once Sinatra and Gardner became their focus, the story spread everywhere. Newspapers described secret meetings, arguments, and dramatic confrontations. Photographers followed the couple across restaurants, studios, and parties. Sinatra made the decision that shocked many of his fans. He left Nancy Barbato and pursued Ava Gardner openly. The two eventually married in 1951, but the marriage did not bring peace. Instead, it magnified the emotional intensity that had attracted them to each other in the first place. Friends later described their relationship as passionate but unstable. They loved each other deeply, yet neither seemed capable of calming the other's strongest impulses. Arguments were frequent and often explosive. Some nights the couple appeared inseparable. Other nights they separated completely, only to reconcile again days later. For Sinatra, the emotional turbulence of the marriage was exhausting, and while his personal life was spiraling into chaos, his professional life was beginning to crack at the same time. By the early 1950s, the music industry was changing rapidly. The big band era that had fueled Sinatra's early success was fading. New performers were entering the spotlight, and younger audiences were gravitating toward different styles of music. Record companies were shifting their attention toward artists who represented the future rather than the past. Sinatra began to feel the impact. New songs that once would have climbed the charts struggled to attract the same level of attention. Radio stations played his recordings less frequently than before. Concert audiences were still loyal, but the overwhelming hysteria of the mid-1940s had faded. Then came the most frightening moment for any singer. In 1950, Sinatra suffered a hemorrhage in his vocal cords during a performance. The injury caused significant damage and forced him to stop singing for extended periods of time. For a performer whose identity depended entirely on his voice, the situation was terrifying. Doctors warned him that pushing his voice too hard could cause permanent damage. For Sinatra, that advice felt almost impossible to follow. Singing was not simply a job. It was the center of his life. Yet every attempt to return to quickly risked making the injury worse. The business consequences arrived quickly. Columbia Records chose not to renew Sinatra's recording contract. Without the backing of a major label, his ability to release new music and remain visible to the public dropped dramatically. Hollywood studios also began losing confidence. Film producers believed audiences were no longer as interested in Sinatra as they had been a few years earlier. Opportunities disappeared one after another. Within a remarkably short period of time, Sinatra had lost the two industries that had built his fame. No major record contract, no major film roles, and a voice that was still struggling to recover. Meanwhile, his marriage to Ava Gardner was collapsing under its own emotional weight. Their arguments continued, and their relationship began moving toward separation. For Sinatra, the combined pressure of professional failure and personal heartbreak created an overwhelming psychological burden. The press did not show sympathy. Journalists who had once praised him now wrote openly about his decline. Headlines suggested that Sinatra's era had ended. Some critics argued that his popularity during World War II had been a temporary cultural moment that could never be repeated. One line appeared in newspapers that captured the mood brutally: "Frank Sinatra is finished." For Sinatra, those words were devastating. Friends later described him as deeply depressed during this period. He drank heavily and withdrew from many of the social circles that had once surrounded him. The constant attention of fame had turned into a silence that felt equally overwhelming. It was during this time that one of the darkest moments of his life occurred. According to people close to him, Sinatra once sat alone in his car late at night in Los Angeles, overwhelmed by despair. The engine was running while the vehicle remained in an enclosed space, allowing exhaust fumes to slowly fill the air. Carbon monoxide poisoning can quietly cause unconsciousness without warning. In that moment, Sinatra was dangerously close to ending his own life. Something stopped him, whether it was a sudden realization, the arrival of someone else, or simply instinct. Sinatra stepped away before the situation became fatal. The details of that moment were never fully confirmed publicly, but the emotional reality behind it was clear. The man who had once caused thousands of fans to scream outside the Paramount Theater had reached the lowest point of his life. From the outside, the verdict seemed obvious. Frank Sinatra's career was over. But Sinatra had built his entire life on stubborn determination. The same defiance that had pushed him to leave the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra years earlier was still inside him. And that determination would soon drive him to fight for one final opportunity, a role in a film that most of Hollywood believed he had no chance of getting. Yet that role would soon change everything. By the early 1950s, Frank Sinatra's career appeared to be over. The music industry had moved on. Record labels had closed their doors, and Hollywood studios had little interest in casting a singer whose popularity seemed to belong to the previous decade. Yet in the middle of that collapse, a single opportunity began to emerge, one that Sinatra believed to change everything. The opportunity came from a war drama being developed in Hollywood. The film was From Here to Eternity, based on James Jones's best-selling novel about soldiers stationed in Hawaii before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The story was serious, emotional, and very different from the musical films in which Sinatra had previously appeared. For Sinatra, that difference was exactly what made the role so important. He wanted to play Private Angelo Maggio. The character was not glamorous. Maggio was a reckless, rebellious soldier who eventually becomes a tragic victim of brutal military discipline. The role required intensity, vulnerability, and emotional depth. Sinatra believed that if he could portray Maggio convincingly, audiences would finally see him as a real actor rather than just a singer appearing in movies. But there was a problem. The studio did not want Frank Sinatra. At that moment in Hollywood, Sinatra was widely considered a financial risk. Producers worried that audiences no longer cared about him, and they questioned whether he had the acting ability to carry a serious, dramatic role. Several other actors were considered for the part instead. Sinatra refused to accept that decision. He lobbied aggressively for the role, contacting producers, directors, and anyone connected to the project. He insisted that Maggio was the role he had been waiting for. Behind the scenes, he continued pushing for an opportunity to prove himself. Eventually, the film's director, Fred Zinnemann, agreed to give Sinatra a chance. When filming began, Sinatra approached the role with a level of focus that surprised many people on set. He lost weight to match the character's physical appearance and immersed himself completely in the emotional intensity of the story, instead of relying on charm or celebrity presence. He focused on portraying Maggio as a vulnerable and desperate young soldier struggling inside a rigid military system. The performance was raw and convincing. When From Here to Eternity premiered in 1953, critics quickly noticed Sinatra's work. Reviewers who had once dismissed him began writing about the depth of his performance. The film itself became a major success, earning widespread praise and strong box office results. Then came the moment that officially transformed Sinatra's reputation. At the Academy Awards in 1954, Frank Sinatra won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. For a man who had been labeled finished only a few years earlier, the moment was extraordinary. The award did more than recognize a single performance. It signaled that Sinatra had returned to Hollywood with a completely new identity. He was no longer simply a fading singer trying to remain relevant. He was an actor who had survived collapse and proven his value again. The impact of that moment extended far beyond the film industry. The Oscar immediately changed how record labels and music producers viewed Sinatra. If audiences were ready to accept him again in movies, perhaps they would also be ready to hear his voice again. Soon after the Oscar victory, Sinatra signed a new recording contract with Capitol Records. That partnership would produce some of the most influential recordings of his career. Albums like In the Wee Small Hours in 1955 explored themes of loneliness and heartbreak with an emotional honesty that reflected Sinatra's own struggles during the previous years. Rather than trying to recreate the youthful sound of his early career, he embraced a deeper, more mature style. The man who had nearly disappeared from the industry was now reinventing it. And this rebirth would soon push Frank Sinatra into a new position of influence, not just as a singer or actor, but as one of the most powerful figures in American entertainment.